Hi, my name is Dr. Christine Harrington. I'm the Director of CELT, our Center for the Enrichment of Learning and Teaching, and today I'd like to talk to you about how to create a powerful syllabus. So in this workshop, we'll be talking about both the purpose of the syllabus and then primarily really on some research studies and their practical applications of the syllabus so that you can take research-based strategies and put them right into practice as you create your syllabi. So let's begin by talking about what the purpose of a syllabus is. Well, clearly there are many different purposes of the syllabus, and here's a list by Bateja and Kirk that talks about obviously the contractual nature. It's really kind of setting the expectations between you and the student. It also is great for communicating concepts and hopefully avoiding some misunderstandings that might happen. And it's a great tool for planning purposes and provides students with a cognitive map of the course. In addition, these are some other purposes outlined by Granette, O'Brien, Millis, and Cohen, and you can see here that some of them overlap with the previous ones we just discussed, but some of the other issues that were not previously outlined were providing students with a teaching philosophy, encouraging students, providing them with supports that will help them be successful, and a little bit more explicit information about policies and responsibilities. When you're creating your syllabus, it always obviously needs to start with the end in mind. What is the learning outcome for the course? What are the learning outcomes for the course, rather? And those really are defined by your department. So at Middlesex County College, each department has approved learning outcomes for the courses. So if you don't have access to that information right now, you'll want to reach out to your chairperson and get that information. So that part's already been decided for you by the department. The next stage of the development of the syllabus has to do with what activities are you going to ask students to do in order to achieve those learning outcomes. And in some cases, these too may be defined for you, depends on your department. You'll need to check with the chairperson, but in many cases, you'll have a lot of freedom and flexibility here to use activities that you think will help your students achieve the outlined course learning outcomes. Now, as you think about learning outcomes, I do want to point your attention to the need for accountability. Many faculty tell their students to read and encourage them to read the textbook because, as we know, it provides, a wealth of information really on the content being delivered in that course, and you simply just can't do it all in the hours that we have with our students in the face-to-face class. However, if we just ask our students to read the text and we don't actually have assignments and activities attached to that, then the likelihood of them reading the text is not as high. So I want to talk to you about some powerful research that might guide you and push you a little bit to hold your students accountable in a very positive, productive way. So this study here by Radiger and Karpik is really a key study in the field of, in the world of SOTL, which is a scholarship of teaching and learning. And the key finding here really relates to how students learn best. And what you can see is that they did an experimental study here, and what they did was they broke students up into 3 different groups. One group was called the study group, and basically they had, some content that they had to learn, and they had access to it 4 times, and they had to study it over and over again. The next group had access to the same information, but only 3 of the 4 times. For the 4th time, instead of giving them the opportunity to review the content, they asked them to recall what they remembered from that content. So it's kind of like a quizzing themselves type scenario. And then this last group over here, they only had access to the content 1/4 of the time compared to the first group over here. And instead, they had 3 times where they had to test themselves to really recall and retrieve that information. And we can see here from the results that practicing retrieval is a very, very powerful memory tool. Now, in the immediate, the group that did the best was actually the study group. So studying the content really did help you hold on to it in the very, very short term, immediately following that task. But if we're looking at delayed, which was 1 week later, and of course I think most of us are more interested in that delayed, holding on to that content for a longer time period, you can see an absolute reversal kind of took place here, where the study test group really performed the best. So the idea here is that by building in practice retrieval opportunities for your students, maybe through a quiz or reading assignments, you are then helping your students actually remember the content. So it used to be that we thought of quizzes as being kind of an an opportunity to show what you know, and now we know that quizzes and reading assignments and actions like that are really opportunities to actually learn more. So they're very, very powerful learning strategies. I also want to bring your attention to an interesting article by Terrace. Terrace really talked about how we have an equity problem in the world, but he wasn't really talking about subgroups in terms of ethnicity or socioeconomic status. He actually talked about the subgroup of undergraduate students. And he said the problem that we have here is that it is not common for undergraduates to be given an opportunity to learn from their mistakes and apply feedback given on a paper or a presentation to redo it. And he says it's not really fair because in the world of academia, at the graduate student level, and most certainly at the professor level, we are given opportunities to revise our work all the time. If you think about it, if you wrote an article for a peer-reviewed journal, chances are, many cases, you're going to get a chance to revise and resubmit that article after getting extensive feedback. Well, Terrace argues that the feedback is really one of the most powerful ways for students to learn, and that we don't do enough of it at the undergraduate level. So I'm going to challenge you as you're thinking about the assignments and what to put in your syllabus, if there's a way for you to link assignments, to build in opportunities for feedback, maybe have them submit either a first draft or attempt or a part of a final product to get feedback on it before they're actually doing that final work. I think that you will be quite surprised, pleasantly surprised at how much of a positive impact this can really have. So again, as you're thinking about your syllabus and the kinds of learning tasks, you want to build in opportunities for activities such as quizzing that are going to promote good practice retrieval, and lots of opportunities for feedback. Of course, the third part of your process is after you've discovered what your learning outcomes are from your chair, you've thought about your learning activities, then you do need to, at the end, assess whether or not they have achieved those learning outcomes. And as you know, you can do that through a variety of means. Testing is obviously one of the most common ones, but it also could be in the portfolio or a project or a paper, presentation. So you need to decide how you can best determine whether those learning outcomes were met. All right, let's take a peek now at some of the research on the syllabus, and I think you're going to find a lot of this to be quite interesting and very, very practical. So we'll start off by looking at this study by Smith and Razzouk, and what they did is they looked at how much students use and recall information from the syllabus. So they had a group of 152 college students, and basically they had to complete a questionnaire on how much they're using the syllabus and how much they recall from it. They were surveyed at 3 weeks and then again in 7 weeks into the semester. One of the good findings here is that students are using the syllabus fairly regularly. So if we look at this combined, we've got about 3/4 of the students looking at their syllabus at least once a week. So that is encouraging. However, this part makes me really upset because they're not really remembering what the primary objectives of the course is. And this, to me, is one of the most important parts of the syllabus, is for students to know why are they taking this course and what are they going to get out of it. So you can see here almost 1/3 of the students had no idea what any of the objectives of the course were. And to me, this is really problematic. So we need to think about how we can emphasize those results. We want to make sure we're zooming in and drawing attention to the learning outcomes or other key parts of the syllabus. Sometimes it's in the syllabus, but students can't find it. We have to make sure that it's easy to navigate, easy to find the information you're looking for. So here's an example, I'm embarrassed to say, of a part of my syllabus many years ago where I would have this list, and actually the list went on so long that it couldn't even fit on this screenshot. So it was a very long list of learning outcomes, and it really was no big surprise that students wouldn't be able to retain all of that information. Now, instead, I'm using a different type of approach. First of all, as a department, we've identified 3 to 5 learning outcomes for most courses, and that really is easier for everyone to remember. And now in my syllabus, I'm drawing attention to it with a little bit of color and with an image to really make sure this part stands out. I really want them to pay attention to what the course learning outcomes are, because this is the primary point of taking the class. We also want to get students involved with the syllabus, so we don't want to just have them use it once on the first day of class. There's no need to really read the syllabus to them. That's really not engaging. In fact, it makes for a very boring first day of class. However, I know faculty feel compelled to cover what's in the syllabus because if they don't say it out loud, they're worried that the students may not understand or grab that information. But the truth of the matter is that really interacting with the syllabus on a daily basis or maybe at least a weekly basis is a much more powerful way for them to get the content they need at the time that they need it. So what I often do, and there's some studies out there about the power of a syllabus quiz, is the syllabus quiz is a great way for students to get engaged on the very first day of class, where you could have them work in groups and you could give them some quiz questions on the syllabus what they have to answer. And then, some folks like to do this online at home if they don't want to use time in class. I actually think it works great as an in-class exercise because it also serves as an icebreaker, but it's much more content-driven and aligned to the course curriculum versus being more generic in nature of getting to know each other. So you can use that kind of activity on the first day, but again, that's not enough. We really need to engage students with the syllabus on an ongoing basis. So what I'll do throughout the semester is that my students know I expect them to have their syllabus with them every class period, and they should have it out on their desk handy because I will often say, okay, I want you to partner up and I want you to go over what the assignments are for the next 2 weeks. And after you look at that, I want you to look at the rubrics attached to that, and I want you to ask me any questions that you have. So I might give them 3 to 4 minutes to really get into the syllabus and to respond to and engage with them about the upcoming assignments. Again, it's at a point when they need the content versus trying to go over every single assignment they need to do on day one. It gets overwhelming, and it's really not something they're going to hold on to all that content anyway. So it's a much more productive approach. Now let's take another look at a research study. This one has to do with what faculty put in their syllabi. So Doolittle and Studinsky, they looked at the different components of a syllabi, and here's what they did. They started off by reviewing kind of core teaching resource, books, etc., and looking to see what they decided were kind of key or important elements to include in the syllabus. They discovered there were about 81 of those different topics, and they looked at them and they were able to merge them into 24 different components that were listed by at least half of those resources. So then what they did was they looked at those 24 components and they identified 4 primary themes: course information, instructor information, grading information, and policy information. Then they went to the web and they found 1,000 syllabi using Google, and they wanted to see whether or not the syllabi that they found had the information that they, that these professionals in the field have deemed important to include. And here's a sampling, it's not the complete list, but of some of the factors that were, kind of assessed. So, obviously some of this key information was done by most people. I'm not really sure why these are not at 100%, but, hopefully course name, instructor name, and textbook should be on every single syllabi out there. But what they really noticed was there's a huge lack of information regarding policy information and support services that can help students. So this was pretty problematic because these were viewed as important to include, and yet they weren't. So it's important for you to think about what content you do have on your syllabus. And at the end of the presentation, I'll share with you a syllabus checklist that is using all those professional resources and have really provided you with a nice list of content you should have in your syllabi. All right, here's another very interesting study by Parent and colleagues. And what was done here was they looked at the likeliness of students reaching out for support and using help. So we all know that there's a lot of campus resources on campus that will help students be successful, but are students likely to use those? And what role does the syllabus have in, encouraging students to actually go and visit with a professor and or other resources on campus? So in this study, it was another experimental study, and what they asked students to do was to review a syllabus, and then they had to answer a survey question about how likely it would be that they would seek help from an instructor. So it wasn't actual help seeking that was assessed, but their likelihood of being, taking action and going to see the professor for a variety of reasons. The 2 syllabi were exactly the same with the exception of 6 words. The supportive statement group had these extra 6 words. Please come and talk to me. Everything else was the same. So we're talking about only a 6-word difference in the 2 different groups. Now here you can see the supportive group had higher and pretty significantly, I mean, they were significant from a statistical point of view, but also from a clinical point of view. These are pretty giant differences. And again, only 6 words were different on the 2 syllabi. So by adding a supportive statement such as that, you can encourage and increase perhaps the likelihood of students reaching out to you. And that might be via email, it might be via in person, it might be whatever. But the key is that they're reaching out to the faculty member if they have questions, which is a really important concept. So providing specific information, not just about your availability, but also about supportive student services, such as counseling and tutoring, etc., is also another key thing you want to make sure is on your syllabus. Now let's talk about the tone of the syllabus for a moment. So Harnish and Bridges, they wanted to look at, kind of a little bit more of a psychological focus of the syllabus and what the tone does. So they looked at, they used 172 students and they compared a friendly versus unfriendly syllabus. The students in this activity thought that they were evaluating an adjunct, and they basically were looking at 2 different versions of the syllabi, well, depending on which group you were in. And I want to share with you the examples of the syllabus. And the reason that I'm sharing this for you is because when I first read this, I didn't actually think the unfriendly was unfriendly. I thought it was actually okay. In fact, I think I've had statements such as those on my syllabus before. But you can see the difference between the friendly. So you're tweaking the language a little bit. You may email me. I welcome you to contact me. Come prepared. I hope you actively participate. So you can see those differences. So now what we'll take a look at is we'll look at the survey results. So you can see for the friendly syllabus, the faculty was perceived as being more approachable and more motivated to teach. They did view the course as less difficult. So now we're not really sure what that's about. We don't want students to think a course isn't difficult because they may then not exert high enough effort to actually achieve success in the course. However, when I was doing a presentation, one of my participants said, well, what if they didn't perceive it to be as difficult because they felt that the faculty was approachable and they had support to achieve it? So maybe they just felt like I can do it, even though it might be challenging. And that certainly could be a factor. We don't know because they didn't assess it at that level of specificity. So you do want to be careful about your syllabus coming across where it's a low-level challenge, because we do want our students to be challenged at our community college, and I think that students really rise to the occasion, and it can be a very motivating factor. But we do want them to feel like they can do it also with the supports that are available to them. Another question I often get asked by faculty about is how much detail should I put in the syllabus? Is it good to go short or is it good to go long and provide information all at once, or is it better to provide information little by little? Well, there really isn't much research on this topic. However, this one study by Seville and colleagues did look at syllabus detail. And what they did was they compared a brief syllabus to a more detailed syllabus, and then students completed a survey. And here's an example of the differences between the brief versus the detailed syllabus. So in the brief, which was only 2 pages, it had all the same information as it did on the detailed version, except for it would have a little bit more specificity. So over here, it would tell you what the exams consisted of, what topics would be covered. Well, over here, it would be much more general in nature. And again, these were all significantly different. So the finding here was that more detail seemed to have a much more positive impact on student perception of the course and the professor in particular. So providing more detail was viewed as being more positive. I actually have gone to the point now where I put all of my content in my syllabus. It starts to become kind of a lengthy document, but it's really kind of viewed as an appendix in the back where I have all the grading, the details about the assignments and grading rubrics. So it's not like I'm expecting them to read all of it at once. You only really need to read that section when it's time to do that assignment. But instead of me telling them, well, this is over here in shared files, or over here I'm going to hand this out in person, it's just very easy for students to keep it all packaged in one place. So I have found that students do feel a little overwhelmed at first, but if you walk them through and they understand that it's not something that they need to memorize every page of the document, but they have to use the syllabus as a resource, just like you use the textbook as a resource, then I find that has been pretty effective in my classes. For this same study, there was some other benefits as well. Again, the detailed syllabus, which is represented by the red bar here, was more likely to be recommended, and students were more likely to want to take another course with that professor. So again, the perceptions are just really much stronger with the detailed versus brief syllabus. So again, we're talking about really adding details, and one of the things that we can do is we can add information about the assignments, as I said before. So if we look at things like using rubrics, putting everything in one spot, we want to also make sure we're sending a positive message. And we can also use tools such as graphs and charts that might take up more space. Back in the day when we had to worry about paper being printed and wasting resources, we wanted to keep the syllabus fairly brief. But now with the access to technology, with many syllabi being accessed on tablets and smartphones and the internet, it's really not quite as critical for us to keep it short. It may be more important for us to make sure that they have access to all the information that they need in a visually effective manner. So if we take a look at some things you can do that might lengthen the syllabus but also increase engagement and motivation, consider adding an inviting image, maybe even onto the very front page of the syllabus. I do this on my syllabi, and I think it really just makes a much more positive impression on students, and it gets them more engaged and evokes some positive emotions about the class. Again, adding details about assignments I think is powerful, so including those rubrics is a great idea at the back of the syllabus. And another strategy is to add the rationale for the assignment. If you're telling students why you're giving quizzes. So here, I say here, I'm giving quizzes because practice retrieval is a very effective learning strategy. So in order for you to really maximize your learning, you're going to get to take quizzes. And I'm actually letting you take these quizzes up to 3 times online because the more practice retrieval you engage in, the better you're going to learn. So if you give students the rationale, that often helps motivate them to complete the tasks. As I said before, you may want to consider some visual images. So by maybe putting a pie chart, I have found this to really be an effective way for my students to understand how much different assignments count. Just a visual image really seems to help, them understand that much better than just a, bulleted list. And as I said before, we really need to make sure that you're using active strategies such as the syllabus quiz and regularly referring to the syllabus throughout the semester. It can't be, something that's only discussed on day 1. So we need to engage with the syllabus in a much more interactive way so that students are using it and see the value of this document. So as promised, I'm providing you here with a syllabus checklist, and here is a list of the different kinds of content items that you should include. So these are the core components that should be included in the syllabus. And again, this is really compiled based on reading lots of literature on the syllabus. And then in terms of organization and clarity, here are some questions to ask yourself. Is it well organized? Is it easy to follow? And you might think it is, but you may want to test drive it with someone else, maybe a colleague or even students, even better, to get feedback on them before it's published. And think about what ways you can really enhance your syllabi in terms of the organization and clarity. And then what about tone? What would somebody say after reading that syllabus? What is it? Does it get them excited and passionate and they can't wait to come to class and learn more? Or is it all rules and regulations and lawyer-like and, I don't want to go to class. I'm not really feeling like this professor really cares and is motivated to help me be successful. So you may not realize how powerful those messages are, but the syllabus is often the very first document a student sees related to that class, especially if you're emailing it out ahead of time before your first day. So it really does set the stage for the first impression of the course. So I want to thank you for spending this time listening to this, training on the syllabus. And if you would like any consultation on the syllabus, you can certainly contact the CELT office. You can email celt@middlesexcc.edu, or reach out to me as the director or one of the other members of the CELT board, and we'd be happy to sit down with you, or talk to you by phone, or whatever works best for you to really help you enhance your syllabi. Best wishes. Take care.